various types of aircraft, including ASW aircraft, S3A, P-3, all categories, and has, over 5,000 hours in P-3s and a total of around 20,000 hours, give or take 1 or 2. And PATH program manager for the Lockheed Flying Operations, and survived an unanticipated spin in a P-3. So I'd like to welcome John at this time.
I started flying the P-3 in 1958, and but at that time, I bet nobody knew that the first airplane actually never flew. The second airplane was the first aircraft that flew. The first airplane was taken out of the production line, brought into what they call a fatigue hangar, structural fatigue hangar. And that airplane was destined to be broken up in the hangar by the use of all kinds of hydraulic jacks. And what we do is we pin these hydraulic jacks to the wing, fuselage, and the empennage, and we simulate flight. So we take a 4-hour training flight, and we figure out what do you do in 4 hours? Make a lot of hard landings, maybe 1 G or 2, and twist the airplane around. So we computerized the 4-hour flight into this particular static vehicle. And then we pressed the button, and that thing went on 24 hours a day until we figured we had an equivalent of 7,500 flight hours in it. After that, we inspected for cracks, and we did have a few secondary cracks. After that point, we decided to break it up. So we pressurized the fuselage, and we started bending the wings. As the wings were bent, we had to go to 150% of strength for 10 seconds. We got to 4 Gs, and it was holding together beautifully. And now the turn, so we pressed the button for 2 more inches, and the inboard area between the fuselage and the number 3 engine shattered, just like a bomb went off. 7075 ST, when it breaks, it's like glass. Even though we got to 4.2 Gs on the wing when it failed, that aircraft could have been flown back. Unfortunately, the top of the wing was missing right from the number 3 tank, so there would be a lot of fuel out of it. But then we found out that we passed the major structural test of 150%. First airplane flown was a performance airplane for flying quality. And I'm going to play this none sound, and I'll narrate it. Yeah, this is the first flight of P-3, as you can see, it's black and white. And this aircraft was completely instrumentated for the handbook. This particular airplane was used to provide all of the performance data for the engine, cruise control, you name it. The aircraft had all kinds of recording equipment. Of course, being the first flight, had to have a little publicity, so the Navy marched a submarine out there, and we had a chase plane on the right. Now, what you're going to see coming up here is some hard landings. This is called a flight testing of P-3B, and these landings are made at 10 feet per second. And these landings were made coming in at 900 feet per minute. Now, this is slow motion, and you can see where that's a 10 foot per second landing. It will bounce back into the air again. Now, the next shot you can see is a little faster. And to make things worse, we had to carry a complete array of weapons underneath the wing, which would give us the highest bending moment of the outer panel. There it is again. There's no flare, there's a spec that's required. The spec requires that the aircraft come in one attitude and not change. And that's a very difficult maneuver to make because you're really not sure if you got 10 feet per second or 14. This is the in-flight structural program. This is a pull-up in what they call a PHA, and that's 270 knots in the left-hand corner, 3 Gs. And it's done precisely by a very fast motion of the stick, as you can see. You pull the stick back and wait, and whatever you get, record it. Then there's a chance that you could break something, and we did. We broke the tail boom. Kind of like a pornographic movie. That thing came off. It fell on the Santa Barbara Channel, and it had about 1,200 accelerometers in which we lost. And this is a rolling pull-out. Everything has to be done very quickly. From a 60-degree bank, fire in the aileron in a half a second and wait. And we got a roll rate of about 37 degrees per second at 270. Then there's a pushover. As you can see, everything flies around the cockpit. This is going down to -1 G. And this is required to see how the engines react to below zero. Well, it just so happened we got a lot of red lights. We went down below -1. There's a number of things that have to be done to structurally make this a 3G airplane. A lot of us to do with feathering it like an outboard and then rolling it and then diving it to 400 knots. I never could figure out this maneuver, but it was required by the mil spec. There's some 30-some maneuvers required to make the aircraft structurally sound according to the mil spec. From here, we're going to move into some other things like icing. I flew the airplane up to Alaska to check with the ice and the icing equipment. And in this case, we let the ice build up to 3 inches in the wing and the empennage. And we wanted to see how much ice it could carry. So at 3 inches of ice, if we flew it at 250 knots, the ice would start breaking off the wing, without the ice. We also got it up to 5 inches of ice. And when we did that, the airplane became unstable. Not only that, you can see a chunk of ice on the horizontal tip here, right there. That's about 3 to 5 inches right there. We did figure out that the aircraft could easily carry 3 inches of ice. We also figured out you should de-ice it when you get 3/4 of an inch. What happened to that airplane, we got dents all over the empennage when the ice came off at 3 inches. That's an ice meter right there. The ice accumulated on the nose came back and sheared off the antenna and wrapped around the fuselage. We had about 25 pounds. It's a very good icing aircraft, done right. Now we're doing an armament. The only reason we drop all these armaments out of Bombay, weapons off the wings and so forth, is to see if they come out and clear the Bombay door. And we had to carry just about every type of weapon in the Navy inventory. We took a look at wobbles, to see how it deployed, and then we finally did 2 complete jettisons of 16 weapons off of San Clemente, which will be coming up next year. This is just a intervalometer drop of 8 depth charges. Why we did that is beyond me, but we did find out that sometimes on the shackle on the right and left, it's very close to nicking the Bombay door itself. And you'll see just 8 weapons in the drink. During some of this testing, we found that the Bombay doors were not strong enough, so we had to beef up the actuators. We also found out that with the Bombay doors open, the propeller being so close to the skin, it was cracking the skin. So we had to beef up the skin in the Bombay alongside the propeller area. I think the most fun I had was dropping. This is a jettison of 16 weapons at 140 knots. The one's coming off the wing and out of the Bombay. And this was one of the tests here to see what kind of G jump you get done unloading so many weapons at one time. And it looks like hell to throw them all in a drink, but we did it twice. The second time at 325 knots, all the chutes came off of the torpedo. The Navy went off and tried to recover all those weapons. I don't think they recovered any of it. We did the rocket firing at San Clemente, and it was a program just to see what kind of damage would occur on the leading edge of the wing, from power and so forth. And we did find that it would run some type of erosion on the paint on the leading edge of the wing, and sometimes when you start driving through a sandstorm, especially with some of the other weapons we had, like a bullpup. This is about the end. You can see there's a boom out here at the end, and crew that did most of the test work, I did about 200 hours with only flight test engineer in the right seat. And meaning the fact is that in case we had to get out, I didn't want to run over a flight engineer trying to maneuver back and back door. Two of them were enemy action, of course, but up to 31 of them, we know what happened to most of them. As you can see, some of them are created by design changes. And actually, some of the accidents produced, one of them produced an APU. Another one that produced minor changes in the control system. And the various things that when an accident occurs, it's amazing, it goes into the engineering and we make an ECP change. Primarily, the pilot error and was the main cause of most of the accidents. Sometimes there was a little bit of hardware that helped them. And unfortunately, there's been some navigational errors where the mountain got in the aircraft descending way or off course at one time or another. And some of them are totally pilot error. I was, almost every accident that occurred, I was generally called out to be a part of the accident investigation team. This first one off of that, Argentia, was a case where the number 2 and 3 generator failed. And the crew called in and said that they were going to return to base. Little did they know that the number 4 generator was also weak. They made their complete approach, and as they came to the point to drop the gear, asked them to drop the gear, they dropped the gear, and the number 4 generator fell off the line, so they had to boost out. The aircraft was observed in VFR weather, headed right towards the coastline, but it impacted the water almost directly beneath where they dropped the gear. In other words, there was a black cockpit, boost out, and loss of control. I came out to Argentia, and 90 feet of water, we recovered only the right main landing gear, which had floated about 50 miles away. In 90 feet of water, you'd think you'd find something, but with the current, it carried the whole, the wing, engines and all, away from the area. And this one from the Philippines, they had 100 smoke light type, Mark 24. They were going to drop 100 of them on exercise. One of them got caught in the free-fall chute and started to burn. And the destroyer called the PPC and said, "Hey, your rear end is on fire." And shortly afterwards, the aircraft, actually within seconds, impacted the water. They were at about 500 feet when it started. And they really should never have carried Mark 24 inside the fuselage. The one in Bermuda was partly a design error. The aircraft had been grounded for 2 months, and they went out for a check ride, and the pilot asked the squadron commander if he could do a little training. And so they started to bounce practice. On one of the touchdowns, the number 1 engine was seen to be feathered, and the aircraft then veered to the right about 30 degrees, and number 4 was in a MTS mode. The aircraft was about 100 knots, and it cartwheeled off the bank into the water, and it left the number 4 fuel tank in a very grassy area. So when we went out to look, there wasn't a drop of fuel in the number 4 tank. Then we found out that when we pulled the aircraft out of the water, all 4 fuel gauges were at 4,700. Then we found out that in a ground wire being disconnected, the instrument would read 4,700 as the lowest it would ever read. It happened with VP-28 on the way back from Hawaii when an engine flamed out, and it read 4,700 pounds, and it was an empty tank. However, in this case here, it was advised, it's foreign policy, not to do any training on a test flight. An aircraft had been on the ground for as long as 60 days. In Japan here, this one in Iwakuni was a pretty sad one. It was under push control at 100 miles out, and at 50 miles out, he was given the clearance to descend to 5,000 feet. Unfortunately, he was well south of course, and he hit a mountain at about a 5,700 area. The aircraft impacted the 5,000 foot point and climbed up this pretty steep slope and went over to the other side. That was a navigational error, and even though the pilot thought he was on course, he was 20 miles south. That's the way that one happened. The Okinawa one was one that I was on for about a week. This is where the pilot took off at midnight to rendezvous with a submarine. He flew out at 8,700 feet, descended to 600 feet, and he proceeded to drop this Hanagway pattern. And as he dropped the fifth one, which didn't light off, the tackle asked him to go back and drop another one, so he did. But as he was making his turn, he could see whitecaps in front of the window, and it was pretty scary. At that point, he impacted the water and bounced back into the air, and then came to rest in 3 pieces. 4 crew members out of 10 survived, the pilot being one of them. And so when we discussed the accident with him, we could never figure out how he got so low, and so we put him under sodium amytal, the truth serum, got him in a point where he could ask any questions and he would answer from the subconscious mind. And we started out with him getting in the aircraft pre-flight, and everything was going fine. We got him all the way out to the rendezvous point, descending, and I talked to him. I said, "Now, did you engage the autopilot?" He said, "Yes, I engaged the autopilot." I said, "Did you engage altitude hold?" He didn't think he did. So I went out and I threw that same pattern. And the one thing he did that destabilized the longitudinal axis was he had the flight engineer hold 190 knots. So as he was flying around and controlling the steering, he was actually starting to descend. And as he descended, the flight engineer was pulling the power back just a little bit at a time, destabilizing the longitudinal axis a little bit more, until he was losing an average of 150 feet per turn. And I did that same pattern. I let him hit the water at the same point. And so we figured that was the fact he forgot to put the altitude hold on. And we modified that, and the design changed again. Lemoore, California was a hard landing. They had made about 3 landings, and on the one landing where there was a F4 pilot out there, he came in and he was completely stalled out. He hit the runway, the left wing departed the aircraft, and the piston flames burned. And unfortunately, all 4 crew members died in that particular accident.
So this one will get
This one here, these 3 aircraft were coming back from Japan, and they stopped at ADAC overnight. And as they landed, they had their flag up the smoke hatch. And the next morning, they all 3 started out. The executive officer in the right seat was the last airplane. As they were going down the runway, just as they were trying to lift off, the smoke hatch opened. And so since the second pilot was in the left seat, the executive had the controls and was going to abort. So they pulled the power levers back into reverse, and nothing happened. So we started on the brakes, and finally decided he's either going to go in the water or in the tundra. So he ground looped it into the left side of the runway into the tundra, which broke off the right landing gear and the wing. And the aircraft came to a stop in the snow and so forth. The crew got out of the back door, but then just about that time, with electrical power still on, the aircraft burst into flames. Why the electrical power was on? Because the number 1, number 2 engine was still running. Flight engineer was the last one out of the cockpit, and he was going to go out of the side hatch, and he feathered both 1 and 2. When we got there, we inspected the cockpit, and we couldn't find anything wrong. After 4 or 5 days, we just were ready to give up on this one. It's just pure something that just occurred that we couldn't get to reverse. Then the executive officer called us from Jacksonville and said that we'd solved the mystery. The flight engineer had pulled the circuit breakers on the pitch lock reset and failed to push them back in. But he did push them back in before he left the airplane. That's why we couldn't find the problem with this particular accident. The searchlight in Nevada one is purely caused by a heavy thunderstorm. The pilot was coming back from Nellis to North Island, and it was a squall line along the Colorado River. It was at 14,000 feet. And for some reason, instead of turning right, he turned left. And the radar controller watched that aircraft, and all of a sudden it was turning back towards Nellis. And then that was the last I heard of it. What happened there, he lost control of the aircraft. And by the time he passed 10,000 feet, he had already sheared off one wing by what I call an overstress, finding himself in a bad, uncontrolled attitude and pulling the stick back. The only way you can break a P-3 is longitudinally. You can't do it laterally or directionally, impossible. But he had sheared the right wing off, and from that point it spun in, and then the left wing came off. And so the only thing left when he hit the ground was the fuselage. And that hit just north of Searchlight, not too far from the Colorado River. It was fairly easy to figure this one out, because all you have to do is take the wing itself, and you can see that the wing was way overstressed by bending moment by trying to recover from a very nose-low attitude in the instruments. Very obvious. The right wing was sheared off by purely probably 4.5 Gs, 5 Gs. The one in Juarez, Spain, was just the fact that he hit 150 feet short, and they had the World War II big concrete slabs out there that stick up about 3 feet, and you happened to hit one with a gear, left gear, which knocked the wing off. And that was the end of that aircraft. With landing that short, there's nothing else. The Canary Island one that it's all the facts didn't come out until later on, but the aircraft was way off course, and there was 2,000 feet. It should have been about 20 or 30 miles further south where it was, but he hit the mountain at 2,000 foot level. The real facts came out that the crew was seen leaving the Oak Club at midnight, and they had an 0600 briefing. And there was some equipment, like he had a problem with the radar, but they went anyway. And that was really a fact that another navigational error. Jacksonville is a very simple one. They got all screwed up with a light airplane, put the gear up, put it down, finally pulled it up again and landed with a gear up landing. The airplane was totally destroyed except for one wing. And it was the wrong wing, because we had an aircraft in Jacksonville that was overpressurized, and we had to remove that wing. But the wing that was the same damn wing that the number 2 airplane had that was overpressurized. This one here was a ditching in the North Pacific. At 43 knot wind, 43 temperature, 15-foot swells, pretty rough area. What happened here is that he had number 1 feather for loiter. He brought it out, just like you're supposed to bring it out. And when they applied the power to it, it started to oscillate between 99 and 101%. And then it took off. It took off in a very overspeed condition. Went to 120%. And it decoupled, and just then decoupled. And when that happened, they watched it for a while. They slowed down, and as they slowed down, the propeller RPM will slow down with airspeed. 40 minutes afterwards, they found that they had a fire warning in number 1. So they gave it the HRD. And then they decided maybe I better restore the oil to the gearbox. Too late. The gearbox was already broken. And they had another fire and HRD. Then they had 2 more after. They watched it. And they could see the white smoke coming out. And so the pilot decided better ditch it. He didn't have to ditch it, really. He could have windmilled forever. But they decided to ditch. Amazing ditching in that rough sea. They lost 2 crew members, the pilot and a fellow in the galley. And the reason the pilot was lost, they got the lifeboats out, and he crawled out of the upper hatch and tried to walk along the top of the fuselage, and he fell off. And when he fell off, between the wind conditions and so forth, they couldn't get at him. And he just kept getting further away, even though he couldn't do a damn thing in the rough sea. They had called an emergency, so C-130 came out, and they finally got a ship out there, and they searched for the pilot for a long time, but no way. The aircraft itself sunk in about 4 or 5 minutes, and the crew was picked up by the Coast Guard, probably in about an hour and a half, 2 hours. But this is a case where a gearbox has been punched a hole in because they didn't put the oil back in. 2, you don't have to worry about a gearbox or a propeller in this airplane. The propeller itself, it might come off. Number 1, if you want to lose a propeller, make it number 1 because it'll go the other direction. And I'll show another accident here where number 4 came off. But however, they really didn't have to ditch that airplane because they were only about an hour and a half from ADAC. And that thing would windmill nice and slow as long as they kept the speed way down. So that was a decision that we felt that was wrong because that propeller would have stayed on, and all you had to do is fly at 160, 70 knots. That would have hung right in there. The one in Illinois was a typical example of the number 1 prop hitting the bank, and it went into number 2 prop, and the number 2 prop blades went into the fuselage. Number 1 propeller completely separated, and there were 2 injuries aboard that aircraft from the blades from the number 2 propeller. QB.1 is one that basically was caused by a hardware failure. After about takeoff, max growth weight, 20 minutes out, the number 4 prop left the engine. It just took off. It also hit number 3 prop and knocked a couple of chunks of blades off, and now they have 1 missing, number 3 feathered. They're at around 20,000 feet. They turned around, and the flight engineer and pilot got together, and they said, we better get this close to the water because we might have to ditch it. So they descended to 200 feet, and they're quite a ways out. Now they're dumping fuel, and they're flying along at 200 feet. They're doing all right. I'm really surprised. But the fact is that when he, getting close to QB, about 1.5 miles out or so, he dropped the landing gear. Now he has to apply more power to 1 and 2. Now he's down to low BMC air 2 engines. More power to the drag of the gear, and it started to roll to the right. And he hit the water in a 90-degree bank, a half a mile short, cartwheeled, and they only lost 1 crew member, and he drowned. He forgot he was buckled to his seat. The rest of them got out. And we wound up with a lawsuit from his wife. I don't know how that came out, but they sunk in 19 feet of water. They recovered everything. And so what happened here is a blade broke on the number 4 propeller. And when a blade breaks like that, the unbalance will allow maybe 2 RPMs before it will shear off the whole propeller. And then went into number 3. And we went to Hamilton Standard on this to find out, has this happened before with any, C-130s or whatever? And we could not find 1 case where a blade had broken. It doesn't have to break more than about 50% of it. And the real cause of the accident was the Hamilton Standard prop breaking foot The airplane could have gone back to base, landed. He just kept his altitude, and he would have made it. But they were so scared that that wing is going to come off. If the wing comes off at 200 feet or 1,000 feet, it won't make a hell of a lot of difference anyway. But I'm trying to say that this wing is an extremely strong wing. It can take far beyond mil-spec bending moments and so forth, and you should rely on the wing, no matter what happens to the engine, other than a serious fire. The air show was a doozy. Maybe you already heard about that one. They dropped 2 Army parachutes off at this Flag Day, and the pilot decided to make a pass through this little channel area, which has a tram car, which is about a 1.5-inch cable that goes across from about sea level to 1,600 feet. I got a picture of the aircraft just a second before he hit the wire. He hit the wire on the number 4 engine and sheared the tail off. And the aircraft, whatever speed, he was probably about 170, 180 knots. He descended and hit the ground in 4 seconds, and we figured that the crew wound up with over 30 Gs of deceleration. That's 30 Gs. He went from 180 knots to nothing in 4 seconds. Crashed on the hotel yard, and a lot of the debris of the aircraft went into the hotel and burned one wing down. Matter of fact, they found a generator in somebody's room. But the fact there is that it just goes down that this was not part of the flight plan. It was making a low pass at that Flag Day. Hawaii is just another mix-up in the landing gear again. They get mixed up with another aircraft, having to go around, and finally they left the gear up. And I just happened to be in the area, so I looked at the aircraft. They landed a nice landing in the middle of the runway, and they held up all of the commercial traffic for almost 10 hours before they could drag it off to the side. So there's another case of gear up landing. The Whidbey Island one, I was on that one. We were doing an obstacle landing, and the aircraft was trained very nose down at 1,000 feet, and then very nose up at about 200 feet. He stalled out. That was the end of it right there. Completely stalled out. The aircraft hit dead center in the center line perfectly, because the landing gear practically went through the concrete. The right, the number 4 and number 3 prop hit the runway, tore off the right wing, and then the aircraft proceeded around to the right, and with only the left wing, no other damage, no fire. We went out and we figured the marks from where the propeller hit the ground. We know it's 1020, so by measuring the distance between the slices, we could tell his airspeed was 88 knots on touchdown. And the only injury he had was the pilot jumped out of the cockpit through the window and broke his leg. The airplane was completely destroyed, and you could see where the landing gear just went right on through the wing area. It was what you call an accelerated stall, descending too fast on an optical approach. I don't think you make those anymore. And he pulled the nose up too sharply and stalled it out. That was the end of the game. The Mons Clemens one was purely pilot error. He had an engine failure and couldn't control it, ran off into the boondocks, and the nose wheel collapsed. One of a considerable amount of damage. It's amazing the damage that he had. I saw the airplane. The aircraft nose gear was folded back, and the stress on the wing from running that main landing gear through that heavy mud and so forth caused a lot of stress around the landing gear hinge points. VP-8 received the first aircraft. We received 10 P-3 This aircraft was flown by the commanding officer on a night mission with a sub. And this is the time when it had APN 117 altimeters, radar altimeters. The aircraft was observed by a submarine making its maneuvers, and then finally he saw it. going to the drink that night. And we could never figure out what really happened, other than the fact that testing this particular radar altimeter could fail without any notification. No red light, no nothing for the pilot. There was a fuse behind it, and when it failed, it would just keep reading the same altitude. And we felt that he was following that at night, and he was descending just at all times. And I don't know why they didn't catch it on a profile side of a regular barometric altimeter, but they didn't. This is the only thing we based the crash on. The only one, was the APN 117. And we couldn't find any other reason for that accident. And that's, this goes down as undetermined. Let's see, as you know, the RAAF lost an airplane at Moffett. It was the fall of the Monasco landing gear. They had a crack in the main landing gear, and they put the chrome right over so you couldn't see it. And after about the 6th, 7th landing, it sheared off, and that airplane burned completely. Amazing, they all got out. We talked about the North Pacific and the QB point gearbox separation. It was undetermined, but the aircraft was flying with working with a sub about 150 miles off San Diego, and it was that night. And PP65 said, "I'm going to come by and give it on top." So he came across on top, and the observer on the sub saw the aircraft go right into the water, right behind the sub, maybe a quarter of a mile and a half mile away. And we couldn't recover anything from that accident. And the only thing we could think about is that the cockpit went dark for some reason or other. And I don't think it was instrumentation, but it came down as a totally undetermined. Unfortunately, the particular squadron that had the VP-19 lost 2 airplanes within a month. And they were back-to-back serial numbers. It was unbelievable. We looked at that back-to-back. We were going to take a look at our production. The one in Japan is another one with low visibility. They went out on a mission. I think it was a SAR mission. The only data we have is from a Japanese fisherman. It's seen the aircraft in very low visibility and then observed it hit the water. And there was nothing to recover on that one either, just a bunch of debris. The visibility was so bad, I don't think they recovered much of anything on that one. One P-3B was shot down in Vietnam, and we don't know where it is. The second one was shot down, was shot in the right wing, and it had a wing fire. But he was near land. So there's the island down there, I don't know which one it is, but there's a 4,000-foot runway. So he declared an emergency, and a destroyer picked up his mayday and so forth, and he made a pass at the runway, and he overshot it. So he said, "I'm going to give it another try." As he was going downwind, he lost control of the aileron because the fire had burned right on through. And he ditched the aircraft almost perfectly. I don't know if it was the airplane or the pilot, but in the ditching, the aircraft broke up, and the destroyer picked up most of the crew members. But he apparently had rigged a standard Vietnam fishing boat, and they got guns. That's happened many times out there, I guess. The Big Sur, California is probably a mystery accident I've ever heard. I don't know exactly where that airplane is today. Nobody knows. The aircraft passed Point Sur to go into, I think it was supposed to be 290 something, 283. Descended through the overcast and was never heard from again. There was about 2 to 3 weeks of searching the waters. It was summertime. We believe it never hit the ground in the mountain area because it would have a little force fire. But we believe the aircraft hit the water someplace, and everything disappeared. Not one trace of it. Not one trace. You'd think you'd find something up on the shoreline, but there wasn't a trace of that aircraft. And to this date, it's just unbelievable. Brunswick, Maine is an undetermined accident, except for the fact they went out to do 3-engine VMC air, number 1 feathered. And it was seen hitting the water by fishermen out there off of Brunswick. Same thing happened to one in Lodges. They were 20 miles out to 5,000 feet, and the radar operator left the station for about 20 seconds, came back and disappeared. They kept calling for the, I don't know what aircraft or squadron it was, but they kept calling him and there's no answer, so they sent some search and rescue people out there, and they found a bunch of debris on the water. And the debris is wooden cabinets, prop cups, things that are worthless. And the depth of the water was about 1,200 feet. And there was somebody talking about trying to pull the wreckage out of the water. I don't know if they ever did, but they feel that they were doing a 3-engine VMC air again, because the last time he was observed, he was very slow. And that's the only thing we can go on, but that's an undetermined one. The Poland Springs accident, the aircraft left Brunswick for Canada for a display, static display. And as it was passing 15,500 feet, structure broke up. And the radar operator observed more than one aircraft all of a sudden. What happened is the right wing came off as he was climbing through 15.5. As the right wing came off, the aircraft was uncontrollable to a point where the left wing came off. And then the vertical fin came off. And the two wings were far apart, and the fuselage, I would say there's as much as 3 miles between one wing and the fuselage. And that was an accident that, from tests conducted at Lockheed, we feel that the vents on those wings were taped shut. And if they are taped shut, the internal pressure of the wing will get to the maximum at that altitude. And it's happened before. It's happened on the ground where you overpressurize the wing. It's about the only way we could figure that in looking at pieces of the wing, you had a top piece of the wing in one place and a part of the wing in another place. And you could analyze the fact that something internally, like an implosion of some sort, which is overpressurizing the wing itself. And it's felt that the thing had gone through the wash rack, and they felt that the tape was still on the vents. One thing we can think about. There was an incident that happened in the Mediterranean that was kind of a classic. You almost want to laugh a little bit, but it was pretty close to a disaster. This aircraft was out on midnight on a SAR mission, 700 feet, and they had number 1 shut down. They had a 3P in the left seat, first pilot in the right seat, unqualified flight engineer in the center, and the number 1 flight engineer was in the SAC. And the observer in the back saw sparks coming out of number 4. And so he woke up to the flight engineer, and they looked at it and said, we better go shut it down. About half of the cockpit had shut itself down and flamed out. So, okay, so you're back on 2 engines. So they applied power to 2 and 3 to start a climb. And pilot called for start number 1. The flight engineer came up, and of course he's standing behind the pilot. And so he's pushing the PCO button, and the pilot's hauling blade rotation. And the first flight engineer thought he was still on PCO. And so the flight engineer reached up and pulled number 2 to number 1. Now it's down to 1 engine, down to number 3. Now the first flight engineer gets in the seat and says, we got to start number 2. So he gets it started. But guess what he didn't do? He didn't pull a power lever back from veto power. that engine went so far over temp and it destroyed itself. Now they're back to one engine. So now we're working on number one. So now they go back to well, you're supposed to start an engine. And they finally got number one started, so now they're on 1 and 3. And they declared an emergency and landed in France. It was a calamity of errors, but they got the airplane back on the ground, but they were flying on one engine twice. And amazing, now you can fly a P-3 on one engine if you're around 80,000 pounds, as long as you're already flying, because I've done it. And I used to do this in air shows. But in his case, his sink weight had to be fairly high on one engine, even on takeoff power. And thank God it was an inboard. If he had been on one engine on outboard, it would be very little control. But that was an error that I can't. It's hard to believe. And what really took place there is that the cockpit lights were very low, and being that the flight engineer is standing behind the pilot, reaching over like this, he just grabbed the handle on the number 2 instead of number 1. And between the 4 crew members up there, none of them knew that the number 2 power handle was all the way up to Mito. And the results are obvious. The engine is just going to go over temp so badly. But a lesson learned. In a lot of these accidents, all accidents are passed on to engineering if you can figure out something to make it safer. There's been a lot of changes in ECPs of the P-3, and the first one is the APU. I was in Washington when I was with the design review. They said, "Why has this airplane got so many generators? You don't need all of them." Well, the Electra had 4 generators and an APU. And I remember I think it was Admiral Russell. He says, "We don't need all those generators." So we said, "Okay, whatever you want." So we took it off number 1. We had 4 generators on this airplane to start with. We took it off number 1. This is in the early test stages. And I always thought to myself, now we're down to 3 generators. Well, that's a lot of power. And then the accident in Argentina put the EPU in the airplane. And we retrofitted all the aircraft, so it cost a lot of money. And then, but never did anybody ever come up and say, "Why don't we put a generator back in number 1? Nope. And yet it's already set up for it. You can just put it in place and add some wiring and you've got another generator. I always say one thing, you can't put enough electrical power in any airplane, especially a P-3 that takes so much power, especially the hydraulic pumps. When you drop the gear, you'll be surprised that you're going up to 5,500 kVA in a split second. And if you got one pump, like on the Argentina accident, the number 4 generator only had 500 and some hours on it, whereas the other 2 had a few thousand. Why did number 4 fail? It's been windmilling so damn long. 2, they were brushed generators. When the brushed generator got wet, they couldn't handle anything. And so I went out with a P-3 with brushed generators, and we had a system where we could throw water on them. Pop, you son of a gun. Those damn things you could drop that landing gear and they'd fall off the line. And so it was determined that you get rid of the brushed generators. So an accident, in most cases, gets an ECP going, which should have been done before. And so now you have an aircraft that, after all these years, I don't think you can do much more to it. You can build a new one, build a P-7. But the P-3C, has there anybody here been on the Canadian CP-140? Now there is an airplane. The design of that airplane, interior for the crew members, is perfect. The Canadians looked at the P-3 and accidents and everything, and they changed a lot of things to make it a better airplane. And I give them a lot of credit for it, and it took a lot longer and a lot more money to build that airplane for them. But the CP-140, as far as I'm concerned, is a far better aircraft than the P-3C. Only because they wanted everything perfectly. And we stick around with dime things and so forth. And now that this P-3C line is going to quit, I think the last airplane comes off in the middle of next year. It'll be the end of it. And I have no idea, but there's going to be quite a gap in between the P-3C and the P-7. But out of my understanding, that very chuck is the P-3 splits. If you take a look, the U.S. Navy inventory of P-3s, and a hell of a lot of them, then I'm sure you're going to get some C's here pretty darn soon. And the A's and B's will be peddled to the foreign countries. There's another thing that's happened, but I try to instigate. There's been a couple of aircraft that had a nose gear that wouldn't come down or hung up. In one particular case, the nose gear has an unsafe. The fly-by-the-tower said, "Oh, it looks great to us, come out and land." So he did. And as he was flowing, the nose gear collapsed. But before he set down, he feathered 1 and 4. I don't know why, but he feathered 1 and 4. Started the APU. Well, you can imagine what happens when the nose collapsed. The propellers in both 2 and 3 would shattered pretty badly. And I suggested to the Navy, I said, why don't you feather 2 and 3 and X them and start the APU? Well, they thought about it. Well, if you did that, you'd have tremendous clearance between the propeller and the ground. I don't say feather them way out. I'm talking about feathering them on approach. I went to Washington with this and showed them the vast clearance that you have by feathering 2 and 3. And NATOP wanted to go along with it because you save the airplane. You just drive it back to flight line once you get the nose gear fixed. But that's the point. You've got lots of clearance when they're X, but you have no clearance when they're running. And the damage they can do when they hit the ground through the red line is unbelievable. And not only that, but you have to change the gearbox and the whole damn thing. I hope to never have a problem with nose landing gear, but it can happen. And this is one way to save the airplane. Is there any question that I could answer on any of these? I might do one last thing. Dutch commander wanted me to take him out and show him a deep stall. And I said, well, doesn't your instructor do that? He said, nope, it won't allow it. So he said, I got the airplane out, let's go. So we went out to Santa Barbara, and I did about 2 or 3 of them where you pull the stick back and you leave them all the way to the stops, get it forward, ease the power up 1 and 2. And I said, let's go ahead and try one. And he gets the stick back, and I said, I think you ought to start recovering. Right about that time, the aircraft went over like this and down and started to spin, very slow. And panic set in because all you could see in the window was water. And I started at 12,000 feet. And I had the stick forward, and I put a lot of power on 1 and 2, and I waited to come out. And it finally came out. And I said, my God, I got the flaps, it's landing flaps. But I said, I got to get a lot of airspeed because I had to pull this nose up, and I don't want to accelerate another stall. And I was looking at that altitude, and I finally got about 220 knots. And I pulled the nose up real slowly and leveled off at 4,000 feet. Then I thought, oh God, I've tested the flaps, landing flaps to 196, and they're good. I've had the approach flaps down to 365 with no problem. But I thought to myself, here I got another country's aircraft, and here we are coming in with a crew back there, white knuckled. And he said, what the hell happened? And I said, Jesus. Well, I said, I'll tell you what, we'll all go to the bar and get rid of this thing. But I'll tell you one thing, if you ever get into an uncontrollable flight in heavy weather or whatever, don't react very fast on longitudinal axis. Anything else is fine. But the longitudinal axis is so sensitive, and no matter what's going on, you've got to ease that thing back very slowly. And if you pull it up a little bit too fast, you accelerate another stall, and down you go, and you lose it. And I wrote a little article for Approach Magazine on this subject, looking at some of these accidents. The one in Searchlight was easy. If he would have come out, he had plenty of visibility, but he had lost it in the weather conditions. If he could just let it go, and then ease it back very slowly, he'd be here today. And but that was a classic. And I keep telling that story that people spin at P3, and I said, not intentionally. I said, this was weird, but it was The aircraft would be up like this, and you lose it, it rolls over like this. Always up, and then down you go, but it spins at such a slow rate. And, but the recovery is very important to be done very slow. Well, anyway, Dutch commander says, I've seen enough. He said, no more. But once you get fully run and installed, which you shouldn't do anyway, that airplane will react like a tiger. It'll snap on you. It just dies unfinished. And it caught me. I thought I could control it, before it got into it. I lost it. But I tell that story back at Lockheed, and he said, oh, that's impossible. I said, ask the flight engineer. He's still awake. Anyway, that's all I have. If you have any questions.